everyone. My name is Katelyn Stephenson, and I'm so happy that you've decided to join me today. I know that time is limited, so I'm glad that you've chosen to share some of it with me. We're going to talk today about demystifying the MBA admissions process. And I want to talk about how we're going to spend our time. I know that the admissions process can feel like a little bit of a black box sometimes. And so what I'm hoping to do is to give you a little bit more insight into what the process looks like, how the AdComs are reviewing applications, and specifically the things that you can do to position yourself for success through that process. We'll talk about how MBA Link helps coach people through that process. Also, some of the do's and don'ts, and I'll share some tips and tricks, things that you can be thinking about right now, depending on where you are in the process. And then we'll obviously leave some time for your questions, because I want to make sure that I'm sharing information that's going to be most helpful for you. So by way of very brief background on myself, my background is in admissions over 2 decades now, which doesn't seem possible. It's been so long. I ran admissions most recently on the institutional side for Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business for both the full-time and part-time program for almost 10 years. And then transitioned to this side of the desk, working with MBA Link and consulting, working with aspiring, applicants just like yourself, really being able to leverage the experience that I've had on the institutional side to help them prepare, applications and present themselves in the best way possible to admissions committees. Through, my work with MBA Link, I have been able to watch our clients just achieve great success at programs both in the US. Many of our clients are looking at the top programs in the US as well as in Europe, and then some in Asia as well. So my background really spans the spectrum of, institutional experience, obviously on the consulting side, and then geographically as well. So what I first want to do is to what I like to call demystify this black box, this admissions process. You've probably heard a lot about it. You've probably read a lot about, the things, the rumors about how it works and what AdComs do and what you should do to position yourself. What I like to do, you've heard that it's a holistic review process, and I think that's a bit of an overused word. So I'm going to use it, but what I like to do is to break it down into 2 dimensions. The first is the quantitative dimension, and the second is the qualitative. And so the quantitative is really the nuts and bolts, the numbers behind your application. And what the admissions committee is trying to assess is if you are set up for academic success in their program. And the way that they can do that is looking at your track record of success in undergrad, in college, or if you have, since earned any other graduate degrees, they will look at all of your academic transcripts. Maybe you have completed a certification or licensing, anything that helps them ascertain your preparedness, your academic preparedness for the program is what is going to be included within this dimension. And a lot of times what they're doing is they're triangulating, right? And so they're looking not only at your undergrad GPA, they're also looking at the strength of your curriculum. They're looking at the institution that you attended, the types of courses that you took. In addition, they're also looking at your standardized test scores. So whether you choose to take the GMAT or the GRE, they're looking at the cumulative score, but then they're also looking at a breakdown of the subscores. So obviously your quantitative section, as well though as your verbal, the integrative reasoning, and the AWA, the writing section, the analytical writing section. And so all of these components are taken together to help them determine the level of your quantitative preparedness specifically, and also to make sure that you're set up for success in their program. Many programs are going to have a core curriculum, typically during their first year, and usually it's going to be pretty rigorous. And so they want to make sure that you are going to be able to handle that. So, the first dimension, if you look at the school profiles in highly selective candidate pools, you're going to have the majority or a large majority of applicants who have all of those numbers, right? They've sort of met the minimums or they're within the ranges. And so obviously not all of those people are going to be able to receive an offer. And so what accounts for that difference is really the second dimension, and that's the qualitative component. And the qualitative component, I like to just talk about it as sort of the touchy-feely part of your application, really the story behind all of your numbers. And that's a little bit less tangible. And that's, I think, where a lot of applicants feel, a little trepidatious about how to present themselves, and, exactly what targets they sort of need to hit. And unfortunately, it's not as clear cut as the quantitative is in some cases, but there's a lot of opportunity there to really, set yourself aside and add a lot of strength to your application. The qualitative component includes most of what you see here. So the story, your professional story, as illustrated through your resume. Typically, this is your one-page document. A lot of times, I think it's a missed opportunity for candidates to not only talk about what you've done, but to talk about how you've added value. How what you've done has mattered to the companies, to the organizations, to any of the groups that you have been a part of, either professionally or even, in terms of undergrad. Also, obviously, your essays, what you choose to share through, your written prose. You have a lot of flexibility there, but that can be pretty daunting. A lot of clients come to me unsure about, where to even begin with that process. What should I say? How should I say it? What if I'm not a good writer? All of that really matters. In addition to what other people choose to share about you through recommendations. Again, even though it may seem like you don't have as much control over this part of your application or this component, you actually really can be strategic about who you choose, how you prepare them, and how it fits into the rest of the package, the application package that you're going to be submitting for review to the AdCom. And so thinking about that and having some guidance around those pieces can be really beneficial to a lot of people who may otherwise feel unsure. And then the last component related to the qualitative part of this dimension of your application is the interview, right? It's the way that you show up. A lot of schools are offering like video essays, video interviews. The video essays, again, it's an opportunity for you to show in person, what your interpersonal skills are like. What is your executive presence like? Do you have gravitas? How are you presenting through this component? Is an indication of how you're going to present to prospective employers, for example, or as an alumnus of this program in the future. And so the AdCom is really looking at both of these dimensions and all of the components within each to ascertain whether you're a good fit for the program, how you're going to benefit from the program, but also how you're going to contribute to the program. And that balance is a really important part of what you need to think about as you're putting your application together. Sounds easy, right? So because this can be a little overwhelming, it can feel a little daunting, even if you know what's required and how they're looking at it. What does it mean for you? And so that's why a lot of people are seeking out help, and you can get help from a lot of different resources. Obviously, going to the experts, people who know the business, they've been on the other side, are able to provide a lot of insight. And so that's really what we do at MBA Link. We provide a team of expert coaches who are able to do just that, to give you insight into your candidacy, to coach you through preparing the different components of your application so that you present the strongest application possible to the AdCom. What's different about the MBA framework or model from some of the other consultancies that maybe you have spoken with, you're hopefully doing research, talking to a lot of different people. Instead of working solely just with one person, one-on-one, we use a team model, as I mentioned, so that you're able to work with a couple of different people, each of whom has particular insight and expertise in their area. And so the idea is that by the time you get to the end of the process, you've had several different sets of eyes on your application, giving you feedback so that you can then distill what sounds right, what feels right to you, and then obviously present that to the admissions committee. What's great about the model that we use also is that we are able to customize it. So while we have a framework that we use, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, we are able to understand and assess where you're at, what your particular needs might be, where are your strengths, how can you highlight those? Where are some of your pain points? Where are some of your areas for potential growth? Maybe weaknesses that you aren't sure how to address. So we can help you identify and then come up with a plan for how to do that through your application process. So how do we do that? Well, I mentioned that although we use a team model, you do have sort of your one point person, your admissions director, your AD, someone like myself, who is able to really work with you as your primary point of contact. They will do a lot of individual coaching with you. They will help put together the rest of your coaching team, and also be able to be the consistent person throughout your engagement. Sometimes people will say, well, if I'm working with a team, do I get that one-on-one? And the short answer is yes. I mean, you're getting the one-on-one with each of your coaches, and you will build relationships with each of them. But also through the admissions director relationship, you'll have that consistent person that is sort of like your cheerleader and your counselor, and will kind of answer all of those questions in between. And so you sort of get the best of both worlds with a team model, but also having that individualized, very customized one-on-one time as well. I mentioned, the need to really think through the qualitative part of your application specifically, and maybe even the quantitative. There could be some questions that you have, things you're not sure how to present. And so what we do is really structure the thinking that you need to do in a very intentional way. And, if there's one thing that I think many applicants that I saw when I was on the institutional side, you could tell that many of them had probably spent time preparing their application, but hadn't maybe spent as much time doing the thinking. And what I mean by that is not only coming up with and packaging their goals, but really thinking through strategically, how do those connect to what they've already done? And if they don't, how are they going to make that pivot? Obviously business school is one of the ways that many people are looking to do that, but also thinking through where some of your gaps in knowledge might be. How do you intend to fill those through the MBA experience, but maybe even beyond that? And so, being introspective, really doing that thinking is a major part of the process, which hopefully you're doing right now. But it can be really overwhelming to sort of sit down and just think, right? And so what we've created is a framework to help you do that. And FAME is an acronym. There are 4 different themes that we organize around as we're helping you with this introspective process. And you can see we're going to help you explore your fit, looking at doing your school research, how your goals are aligned and your interests with some of the different programs and what they're offering. We'll talk about your abilities. We'll give you an online diagnostic to help you identify those, and then think about, how have those abilities manifest thus far in your career and in your life? And importantly, how do they connect to what you want to do moving forward? Your motivation, obviously your goals, right? What is motivating you to go back to business school, but specifically, what are you hoping to do in the short term and then even in the longer term, right? You may need some help. You may have some, ideas, broad ideas, but you may need some help articulating it in a more concrete and actionable way. And then the last part of FAME are what we call the experiences. And this is both professional experiences, but also personal experiences. It's thinking through what have been those different inflection points in your life. What have been some of the cornerstone experiences that you've had that are part of who you are and are going to comprise your narrative. And this is really lays the foundation for the rest of your application process, but also specifically for your essays, so that by the time you get to essay coaching, you've already generated some ideas and actually already done some writing as well. And the goal is that you can repurpose some of this content or use this content as a starting point for crafting those essays. And the essays, I feel like clients are usually the most nervous about those, maybe not even the most nervous, but depending on their comfort level with writing, they're not sure kind of where to begin and how to make it really good. And so that's where we can help. And we start helping you with that process by, guiding you through thinking about it through, like I say, this FAME framework. Another thing I like to note about FAME, one of my favorite clients from a couple of years ago, she's actually at Wharton now, she had reflected that FAME was obviously helpful to the admissions process, but that it felt more like life coaching, because rarely do you have an opportunity to really step back, take a breath, and think about some of these bigger picture ideas. But to do it with the help of an objective perspective, in this case, a FAME coach or an executive coach that can really help you identify, they can help ask the right questions to help you come up with some really concrete ideas about each of these different themes. And that's important because, like I say, what I find and what I have found is that those who do the thinking, I can't emphasize that enough, usually create the most compelling applications because they've thought a lot about what's brought them to this point. And that's really what you want to do through the application process. So the other thing after you finish with FAME, we'll help you with resume coaching. I mentioned earlier that the resume is, a one page, usually it's one page. There are some exceptions. Typically, if you've been working for more than 10 years, or if you're in certain industries, maybe you've published a lot, but otherwise most people applying to business school should have a one page resume, which means that that's really valuable real estate, that one page. And so you need to think through what should be on there. I mentioned being really strategic about not just including what you've done, but talking about and quantifying the value that you've added. That's important because, again, that's an indication of the success that you've had and the potential that you have for continued success, right? And so on the resume, if I could give you like 2 tips right now, one is to be really mindful of any gaps in your resume. Make sure that you're prepared to talk about and address those. Even if it feels like, oh, I don't really want to talk about the fact that, maybe you were laid off, or, maybe you were in between jobs for some other reason. The admissions committee is going to see that. So you want to be as proactive as possible about addressing issues like that. And so as you are thinking about putting your resume together, you'll want to think about addressing those gaps, probably through like an optional essay or something like that. Or maybe you left your professional job to, pursue a certificate or some other endeavor. Make sure that that's on your resume so that the AdCom, as they're reviewing that, can understand and follow the story. So that's the first thing, is accounting for gaps. The second thing is that you want to show progression as much as possible. And so, what that means for some people is that you have, been promoted, maybe you've had a job change. If you've been at a company for, several years, it's great to show that growth. Not all companies work that way. Not all people are able to show that they were promoted, every year, or maybe not at all. Maybe that's not how the company functions, but you're able to show growth in other ways as well, through the, quality of work, level of responsibility that you were taking on. And so you'll want to think about that so that you can show that you've been moving ahead for however long you've been working, post undergrad. And then, the last thing I would say about the resume is to, add some personal aspects as well. There's sometimes a section for other skills, interests, activities, because it's supposed to give an idea of who you are as a person as well. And hopefully that's somewhat reflected in the activities and the jobs that you've held. But if it's not, make sure to include something like that as well. I know whenever I was interviewing candidates, and still whenever I look at a resume, I just always look for something personal that I can, use as a way to maybe start conversation. And so think about including that as well. It doesn't have to be solely professional and, completely buttoned up. They want to know you as a person, especially when you're talking about preparing a resume for an MBA application. I mentioned the essays, and obviously this depends on the questions that the school is asking. You will be able to repurpose content probably from essay to essay. There's only so many ways you can talk about your goals, but what you don't want to do is, write 1 or 2 essays and then try to just send it off to lots of different schools. I'll give you 2 tips about the essays. One is that if you can substitute any program's name into your essay, you probably need to go back and you need to customize it a little bit more. So there's a check for you. You could maybe use some of the same content, but you really want to make sure that it's customized for the program. And so be, mindful of that. And the second thing is probably what you've been hearing since elementary school or whenever, you started writing, that you want to proofread your essays. And when I say proofread, it means not only, spelling and grammar, obviously the mechanics is important as well, but making sure that you don't have any silly or embarrassing typos, or importantly, that you include the school's right name, the right school's name or the right program's name in the essay. AdComs know that you're applying to lots of different programs, but they also want to know that you're serious about their program. And so really paying attention to those details can make a huge difference, especially in highly selective candidate pools. The last thing I'll just talk about briefly, again, I mentioned video essays. I guess in the past couple of years, these have become more common, and specifically certain schools are now requiring them as a step before inviting people to interview in person. And so sometimes can feel like a little bit of an artificial setting. Typically it's a video recording, and it's spontaneously you'll get questions that you get 2 minutes to answer. But it's a really important part of the process to prep for, because it's an opportunity to show up, as I mentioned, to show how you present, even if it feels like it's a bit artificial. And it's an important way for you, hopefully, to get yourself to the next phase, which is to have an in-person conversation, even if it's via Zoom or whatever, as many interviews were this past year. And so we do a lot of coaching around that because not everybody's done that before and not everybody's entirely comfortable doing that. And so that's an important part of the process. Interview coaching, obviously, whether you're doing, an individual traditional one-on-one interview or you're doing a team-based interview, which some schools are moving to, we will, coach you on just like when you are interviewing for a job, right? That you are well prepared, that you understand what it is that you want to share, but also that you're demonstrating your ability to be personable. They are assessing your conversational skills. Most of the time, they are going to be conversational. They're not meant to be gotcha interviews. They typically don't involve case questions. There's some exceptions there. They can be, conducted by admissions folks. They can be conducted by current students or alumni. And so understanding all of that and then knowing how to prepare is a really important part of the process, especially because if you have been invited to interview, which most of the schools are by invitation only, that means that they're obviously very serious about your candidacy. So in the very final part of the process, you want to make sure that you're still putting your best foot forward. So that's a lot to prepare for, I know. I mentioned how we, implement and use FAME as the introductory of the beginning part of your process. But one of the first things that we like to do is a pre-assessment. We do a strategy session with you. I encourage you to do this on your own, but obviously doing it with guided assistance is even more helpful. Establishing your timelines based on the deadlines. I think it's important to know, because you're so busy, you're managing a lot of different pieces. Many of our clients say, look at that's what I need help with. And we can do that so that you make sure that you're on target and that you're not rushed through the process. It can actually be a pretty enjoyable process, but becomes a lot more stressful when you feel like you're under the gun for time. And as those deadlines approach, and they do approach pretty quickly, that can sometimes happen if you don't have a set plan in place. And also somebody to check and make sure that you're on track. So that's important as well. And then, the last piece I mentioned, the application process, but is, when you get to the other end of the process and you've received all of those decisions, understanding, how do you weigh your offers? How do you potentially appeal for more scholarship? If you're placed on the wait list, what does that mean? And how do you navigate that process and strategize? And so, having some help with all of that can be make the process just a lot less stressful and ultimately much more successful. So I know that I gave you a ton to think about and probably overwhelmed you with a lot of information, but I want you to be able to think about not only some of what's happening on the back end that you need to prepare for, but also how you can integrate different coaches and people to help you through that process, because there are a lot of resources out there to help you. So with that, what I want to do is open it up to any of your questions. I had a couple of questions come up. Let's see, a couple of people chatted me questions. So let me just look at those. Okay, so one of the questions from Shivam, thank you, is specifically about the quantitative part of your application. And I talked about within the quantitative dimension, he's asking basically, what if you didn't do well in undergrad? And it sounds like, I guess this could be more generally, but specifically with the quantitative, or what if your GMAT is a little bit below range, or it's not as high as you want? And that's a question I get a lot. Probably one of the number one questions that I get sort of around this is, what can I do? Especially because, your undergrad transcript is baked at this point, right? You can't go back and redo undergrad. And so your GPA and your grades and all of that is set. And that is true. However, you do still have an opportunity to provide other, what I call proof points. So maybe your undergrad, you didn't perform as well as you had hoped, or maybe you got off to a really rocky start. It's not uncommon, first or second year, you're adjusting to school. Maybe there were other circumstances that influenced or affected your performance in a given semester or a given year. That's all information that's really important for the admissions committee to know. It's not that you're necessarily making excuses, but you're giving them more insight into what was going on. And more importantly, other pieces of data that show that you are not going to have this issue moving forward. So for example, I have a client who had just some really challenging personal trauma that influenced the beginning part of his college experience. He was able to turn it around, but his overall GPA was still a bit lackluster. And so, what we did was to talk through how he could structure his optional essay to address this, and not only talk about what happened, right? Like giving providing context around his undergraduate transcript, but what he did in response to that and the steps that he took to address that. And that's really important. That's what AdComs want to see. So instead of just, identifying a problem, so that it doesn't sound like you're making excuses. Another big one I hear is, I'm just not a good test taker. And that's why maybe your GMAT or your GRE score isn't as high as you want it to be. That may be a fair point. But as an AdCom member, what I always appreciated was someone who would identify that and then tell me the steps that they had taken in order to address that. And then, what the result was. And so think through if there are any academic or quantitative weaknesses that you have or concerns that you have about why that is and what you've done about it. And there are things that you can do about it. So maybe you were an undergrad 5 years ago and you didn't do well, but you can take courses now. Maybe you've taken courses since then. That's a great way to show. It's not only a great way to get back into student mode, but it's a great way to show that you can be back in the classroom. You're more mature now. Maybe you're more focused, and you can, earn those grades. And more importantly, it's indicative of what you're going to come and do in business school and do at their program. And that's ultimately, remember, the questions they're asking. Is this person set up for academic success? If you didn't do well or you flunked out one semester in college, they may be asking, how do we know that this is not going to happen in business school? And so you have to be able to proactively address that. And that's true with any sort of perceived weakness. I like to call them areas of growth, right? So whether it is your academics, in college, as an undergrad, maybe it is your GMAT, GRE, like we talked about, or it could be something else related maybe to your professional background, maybe a layoff or something like that. Really be proactive about it and be solutions oriented about it. I would say that's the best way to address those issues. And just to add one more thing, I mentioned the optional essay, but that's why they give you that space in your application. You don't have to write anything. You shouldn't feel compelled to, but if there's something that needs more explanation, that's exactly where you should do it. And I spend a lot of time actually strategizing and coaching clients on if they should use that space and then how can they maximize the effectiveness if they do feel like they need to or choose to. So hopefully that answers your question, Shivam, about that. I have another question here. This is a good question that I get a lot as well. And the question is about the timing of your applications. So many of you probably know that there are several rounds, typically 3, some schools offer more, 4 rounds that you can apply for an MBA. And, the thinking is always to apply as early as possible. Most admissions folks will tell you that. But the caveat or the most important part of that is to apply when you have the strongest application possible. And so applying in round 1, most of those deadlines will start hitting in like September. HBS, Harvard Business School, usually has the first deadline. That's normally the first week in September. And then a lot of the top US programs and some of the European programs as well, their round 1 deadlines will be throughout September, some early October. And so at this point, you still have time to prepare. But if what you find as you're getting closer to that deadline is that, you need more time to maybe retake your GMAT or your GRE, or maybe you are not as comfortable with your essays, or maybe there's an issue with your recommender, right? Because that's not always within your control. But you want to make sure that if you need more time, that you then, reorient and you could prepare for round 1 with the best intention of submitting the best application you can. But if you don't feel like that's possible, you then have round 2 that you could fall back on. Round 2 deadlines are usually in January. So that gives you a pretty good chunk of time in between, what would be September, round 1, and then January for most schools for round 2. The other question that I get related to that is, are my chances, do I have a better chance if I apply in round 1 versus round 2? And I would say that, when you look at the school profiles, most of them are presenting all of their admission stats in the aggregate. So they're not breaking it down. That said, from an insider's perspective, usually the strongest in terms of quality applicants apply in round 1, but the highest volume is almost always in round 2. And so the majority of people are admitted in round two. So really, don't try to game the system because it's hard to tell and it varies from year to year. What I would say is if you're a strong applicant in round one, you're going to be a strong applicant in round two. Or if you feel like you'll be a stronger applicant in round two, then that is definitely, where you should focus your energy. Notice that I talked mostly about round one and two because I would recommend applying by round two. For international students or non-US citizens or permanent residents who will require an F1 student visa, schools will almost always say that you have to apply by round two, or that priority consideration is given. Also usually for scholarships as well. So there's another incentive to apply by round two. But the reason for that is so that they have time to process a visa for you. Round three deadlines tend to be later in the spring. And so, depending on the timing and what country you're coming from, it may not always be possible to turn around a visa. And so for that reason, round two should definitely be your focus if you are a non-US citizen or permanent resident, like I say, and you're requiring a student visa. The other thing is that, round three, look at people get admitted in round three, and there are still fantastic candidates in round three. However, most schools at that point have already seen 2/3 of their applicant pool. And so for that reason, a lot of times round three, a lot of times people say, oh, it's sort of like the waiting list. Even if you're really good, there may just not be space available at that point. So again, it doesn't mean that you won't be admitted in round three, because certainly people are admitted in round three and adcoms know that they're still going to get really great applicants. But if you can prioritize round one or two, I would definitely recommend doing that. And then the last piece that I just want to add about this is to think strategically between round one and two about how you might maybe submit a couple of applications in round one and then maybe a couple more in round two. The round one notification deadlines, it depends on the school. You'll often be able to receive a decision back on your round one application before the round two deadlines. However, it's going to be, just if you look at the calendar, there's usually only a few weeks in between. And so just be prepared that if you do have to or want to submit in round two, that it'll be a pretty quick turnaround from when you receive your decisions about round one. So that's really important as you're thinking about strategy. I do a lot of application strategizing just like that about which round and which schools and which round. So can definitely answer more questions about that. But hopefully that gives you a little bit more insight into the timing of the rounds and how you might want to be thinking about choosing which round is best for you. All right. So the next, let me see, I just want to make sure I'm not missing any questions here. Okay, so the next question, and we'll make this our last question, just in the interest of time, but I am available for individual questions if you want to contact me. But this question is about work experience and if you are light on work experience. So this person in particular is saying, should I apply if I only have 2 years of work experience? So, the first thing that I always like to note is that MBA programs are typically looking for people with several years of work experience. The average number of years for MBA students in the US at least is about 5 years. It's trending a little bit less lately and in recent years. However, more important than the quantity of work experience is the quality of your work experience. And so if you have 2 years, but it's really substantive, that can be just as effective as someone who maybe has been stagnant in their role for 4 or 5 or more years. And so it's important to be able to talk about your work experience in a really effective way. And that's what we coach people on how to do. How can you talk about what you've done in those 2 years? The other thing that I want to note is that you will probably be applying in the fall, especially if you apply in round one, but you'll technically be calculating your work experience and the outcomes will up until you would enter. And so think about whatever work experience you have now, you'll basically add a year. And that's assuming that you're going to work up until you would enter business school. And so they know that you're going to be continuing to gain professional experience during the application process. And that's important. So if you feel like, well, I only have 2 years, okay, well, yeah, but by the time you enter, you will have 3. And hopefully this year in between, you'll be using really effectively, you'll be progressing, continuing to build your skills. And that's what the AdCom is expecting as well. So that's just really important to think about. The other question that I usually get related to lighter work experience is how you should think about or talk about your work experience in college. So typically, or technically, what qualifies as work experience when you look at the average number of years, the way that schools have to calculate is post undergraduate. So from the time your degree was conferred, any work full time work experience after that counts toward your number of months of work experience. And so what that means is if you're non-traditional, maybe you are an adult learner who went back to college, later. And so you worked full time for 5 or 10 years. This is sometimes especially the case with military service numbers. And then, you didn't get your degree and you've only been working for a few years after that. That's okay. Obviously, the AdCom will take that into account. Similarly, if you worked in undergrad, it doesn't mean that work experience doesn't count. You may have had really substantive and notable, internships, for example. And so they want to know about that. It may not just officially be calculated into your work experience, but it can certainly still influence and, be a really compelling part of your application. And so definitely continue to highlight that and talk about that, but just understand how the AdComs are calculating and thinking about work experience beyond that. And so that's the last thing I would say about that at this point. I hope that I've been able to, address some of your questions, maybe shed a little bit of light into the process so that black box doesn't feel quite so opaque. I would love an opportunity to talk with you more if you are interested in coaching, if you're interested in understanding more about what we might be able to do for you using our expertise. We provide free consultations, no obligation. So you can reach out to me. I've provided my email here. I've also provided the link to some of our recent client testimonials from this past cycle. And that's a great way to understand, what were their experiences like, not only with MBA Link, but even with the application process. You can see the types of schools that they are getting into and just generally what, words of wisdom they might share with prospective students like yourself. So I definitely encourage you to take a look at some of those videos. And then, lastly, just try to enjoy the process. It's not meant to be a set of fire hoops that you have to jump through, but it is meant to be rigorous. And there's a reason why the admissions committees are requiring so many different components and asking you to really think about and present yourself in this way. And so hopefully you can enjoy some of that. I know it can be overwhelming and a little bit stressful, but if you have help and guidance along the way, hopefully it will be a bit more enjoyable. And it's the first step in your MBA journey. So really appreciate you joining me again. Hope that we can continue the conversation and come back for the remaining sessions in our webinar series. We'll be delving into a little bit more about each of the components and some of the topics that I've talked about today. So look forward to hopefully seeing you all again and wish you all the best. Take care.